It tried to create an economics that was compatible with social justice and human rights. The third globalization, however, the third stage globalization, is very different. It really began with the fall of the Berlin Wall, but you could look at a number of other issues in which it began. And there were 4 or 5 trends that came with that stage of globalization, and I think it's that very stage that we're talking about now in terms of how do we rid ourselves of the incredible violence that's caused by these trends. First, we had a process of recolonization of the world. And particularly, it was the recolonization of the Third World, and it was the recolonization of the Third World by global capital. It was an economic globalization. It was the globalization by Coke, by McDonald's, by Microsoft, and by other international organizations. The luxurious items became necessities for people. And the world started to be ruled by multinational corporations who were manufacturing human desires. A second trend in this globalization was the privileged treatment of foreign investors. So the foreign investors began to be treated better than the nation-state's very own citizens. They became why we created law. The third was that the WTO, the World Trade Organizations, became very important to ending the redistributive state. In other words, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, started to control things like the major pharmaceutical industries, creating, for example, the TRIPS agreement, which in fact denied drugs to many of the third world countries, or what were called the third world countries. It was the end of the interventionist state that was caused by some of these international organizations. And it weakens the state of the poorest people in those countries. It actually enhanced or increased the state of the richest people. So the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Foundation, want the strong nation state to support the mobilization of foreign capital. They have an investment in the way in which the nation state runs, and they therefore have an important goal to ensure that there is not a mobilization of the local labor. The infrastructure development was pursued because foreign investors needed it. Another trend was the de-governmentalization of the South. There were no the macroeconomic policies which are made by some of these international organizations, such as the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, and also added to those are some of the regional development groups, such as the Asian Development Bank and the South American Development Bank, and so on. Those are organizations which are responsible to no one. They are not responsible to the nation state. They are responsible to the huge organizations, multinational organizations, which are actually controlling very much of what goes on in terms of our discussions of social justice and nonviolence. Finally, they killed this third stage of globalization, really killed the language of social justice. It killed the language of peace. There's no language left anymore for us to talk about justice in contemporary economics or to critique its processes. We are left without the kind of language that in the second stage of globalization, based on rights and justice, actually led us to have this dialogue. We now have no place in that dialogue. So we end up now with new human rights. We end up with human rights which are really the human rights of organizations, the human rights of trade-related issues. So we have people talking about the human rights of global corporations, human rights to do the right to free speech and expression, for example, and the right to health. But the right to health becomes the right of major international organizations to decide who gets health and how they get health. So we have a whole new creation of human rights, which is not based on the discussion that I heard this morning and I'm hearing this afternoon, which is related to social justice and to nonviolence. It's and we very often hear now that the idea or the concept or the words that it's all right to do a little wrong, or it's okay to do a little wrong if we're going to end up with a great right. And I think that's one of the things we have to look at when we start to talk about nonviolence, because very often what we're hearing now is a little violence is okay because it will solve another problem. Let me briefly, very briefly, just say that I think there is a way that we can move forward, perhaps, because I kept hearing people this morning with some hope, and I think we ought to have some hope. How do we address that normalization of the globalized economy? How do we address the normalization of violence? How do we address those issues which have become part of how we identify ourselves and how we have conversations? I think we need to consider three elements of social well-being. One is that we have to have autonomy, both for the individual but also for the nation state. Autonomy, independence of this kind of globalization. Secondly, we need to have equality in the sense of equal outcome. Not that people are the same, but that each person may need more to be able to arrive at a similar end. And we need that again in the sense of both the individual and in the sense of the nation state. Finally, I think we have to have democratization. And that's not about democracy, although we all claim ourselves as being in great democracies. But I think we have to look much more at participatory politics. And we have to have participatory politics, again, at the individual level, but we need to have participatory politics at the state level. So we need to think about how states start to interact with each other and actually create a kind of politics about social justice and about nonviolence. I thank you very much for your time.